Now, so for the second part of this, I've still got the Slido poll in front of me, so please continue with the Slido questions as we move forward. So for the second part of this, so having taken on board, I hope, a lot of the issues, and I hope the panel showed you that some of those issues are a lot more complicated than they seem at first glance. For the second part of the session, we're going to start talking about digital identity in detail, and I'm going to try to show you a model for thinking about digital identity, which I hope will help us with some of those issues. So I'm going to talk you through the model, and then a bit later in the session, Paul is going to join me from Forge Rock, and he'll take you through 3 large-scale case studies to show you how these things can be deployed. Can we switch to the slides, please? Thank you very much. So I'm going to try and cover a few things quite quickly in this session. We don't need to read all this. You guys can all, everybody can read, can't they? Yes, okay. Back on this. So let's spend a couple of minutes just summarizing what the identity problem is from what people talked about. As is common for people of my generation, we never start anything without a quote from Marshall McLuhan, who was right about most things, and this is no different. Now remember, McLuhan was writing in the early 1960s when he was thinking about this. There was no internet at that point. I mean, he was thinking, what happens when we're able to connect everything together? And this is well in advance of being able to connect everything together. This guy was a genius. Remember the global village? And it doesn't mean anything to you, does it? I've made a catastrophic demographic mistake with the audience. He was Canadian. That's all you really need to know about him. So, all right, we'll skip over. All right, so Marshall McLuhan, you can go and look it up in a history book somewhere. It's important for people of my generation. So my point is, even if we take the simple, forget Marshall McLuhan, it's just the, did you ever see the Woody Allen film Play It Again? When he, no, okay.
I'm a big Marshall McLuhan fan.
Thank you very much. I got a supporter in the front row. This is what counts. So, but Canadians have always been crazy about privacy and whatever, haven't they? It's a funny, yeah, that's definitely true. So even if we take a very simple example, I mean, I was trying to think, like, what's the simplest example of identity fraud that we've done absolutely nothing about, right? And so I was thinking card fraud. Card fraud's a really simple example of this. Is card fraud going up or down? We've spent billions on bringing in chip and pin and all that sort of thing, and card fraud has gone up. Now, rather amusingly, it's gone up in America, so we don't really care. I mean, basically, we've basically exported our card fraud to America, so it's okay. It's not our problem. But you know, just like as a general point, we haven't fixed it, right? With all of this stuff that we've been doing, America is what, 20% of global card volume, half of all global card fraud. I'm very sad to report, because some of my favorite slides. I'm very sad to report that later this year, I think September, the signature mandate ends in the US. So one of my favorite things about going to the US is when you buy something with a card, you can sign anything for the signature because nobody looks at it. And people do art and little drawings, and I always use the name of my favorite footballer, Sergio Aguero, Lionel Canagero de Castillo. That doesn't always fit in the little thing, so I just put Sergio Aguero. But you see what I mean? Like we've had this huge change going on, and we've spent lots of money, and we haven't actually really fixed the problem. And now we're talking about 3DSV2 and blah, blah, blah. So do we develop a tactical response to the identity problem in the card space, or do we just see that as one of a spectrum of problems that all have the same underlying problem, which is we don't have a proper digital identity infrastructure? Obviously, I'm in favor of the latter. That's one example. The second example, we haven't fixed that, right? And we're about to put another few billion things on the internet where we already know the security doesn't work. We already know. We've already had, this isn't some weird science fiction project. We've already had hacked fridges, right? You remember the early days of the internet? You're not old enough to remember this, but for many of us in the audience, in the early days of the internet, they used to say, the internet is fantastic. It was built to withstand nuclear war. right? That was the whole kind of internet point. It's built to withstand nuclear war. Twitter was brought down by a network of toasters. I mean, let's hope the North Koreans decide not to stockpile toasters when they give up their nuclear weapons, because I mean, we could be in a real problem. And there's a fantastic, because if my toaster is used to bring down your bank, I don't care. I don't. It doesn't affect me. Does it cost me money that my toaster is? It doesn't. The whole it's wrong. You know, we can see now that the whole infrastructure that we're building is completely wrong, and we haven't even started building it yet. This doesn't seem right to me. Simple problems like car fraud. This, we're building a system that doesn't work, and we already know it doesn't work. This is baffling to me. And it's getting catastrophic. I mean, it used to be funny when it was just well, it was funny 5 minutes ago, in fact, when we were moving our card fraud to America. That's funny. We don't mind. We can have a good laugh about that. Hacked fridges bringing down Twitter, hilarious. I think that's funny too. But it's not funny anymore, because McLuhan was right. These are new ways of being evil. It's funny when like if my card gets hacked by some Ukrainian, sorry, there's no Ukrainian hackers in the room, so I don't want to be insensitive to, just generic. If my card gets hacked by Eastern European card geniuses and used for nefarious purposes, I don't really care. It's the bank's problem, not mine. That's why I use a credit card in the first place, right? But when it's your car getting hacked and people crashing your car because it's a laugh, that's a little bit different. So the fact that we don't have a proper digital identity infrastructure is in this transition from being diverting and amusing and who really cares to being absolutely fundamental. Because card fraud and hacked toasters and fake news are all refractions of the same underlying problem, that we have no digital identity infrastructure. Worse still, we have no conception of what that digital identity infrastructure, no, let me rephrase that. Worse still, many people have no conception of what that digital identity infrastructure should look like. I, of course, do, which is why we're having this little discussion. Okay, so please just accept my framing of the problem, which is that all of these things are not separate issues, but are actually the same underlying problem. And you're all here because you think, as I suspect, digital identity is a way of doing something about that problem. Okay, so what are people doing to do something about that problem in the real world? I hope you don't mind my labeling here. This is very lazy, and I was very tired. It was very late. So I've just made some quick labels, which I know at least one person in the audience will probably object to. But it's for sake of argument, just do it. So I just want to, if we have a quick trip, what are people doing about it? We have what I would call the Anglo-Saxon model. So this is in the UK, USA. We have the idea that the government is going to build a framework for digital identity, and then private sector organizations are going to provide the identities. So there's a broad spectrum of opinion on this kind of thing. I think opinion is very divided. Everybody else thinks this is a good idea. I don't. No, I'm joking. Nobody thinks it's a good idea. Louise, would you say this is broadly working or not working in the UK? You know more about this than I do. Broadly not working. Okay, let's go over to another one then. So then we have what I would call the Commonwealth model, which I was going to tease Andre about. I'll tease him about it anyway when he's feeling a bit better later on. I like calling it the Commonwealth model. So this is Canada, the sort of thing they're thinking about in Australia, where you have a network which is made up from the banks and other third parties, like the mobile operators and so on, who are going to work together cooperatively. This would never happen in the UK, by the way. But they're different people up there. So they're working together cooperatively to create a digital identity infrastructure. And you understand how this sort of thing would work. You walk into Rogers to rent a mobile phone, and they can request the bank data that proves who you are. The bank asks for permission on your phone. You give permission. Under the scenes, everything's done with keys and certificates and various cryptographic voodoo to make sure it all behaves itself. But this is people working together, different kinds of private sector organizations. We have what I would call the continental model. Now, you see, that's a very funny joke. Is a continental model. You see, that's Sim Sikkut, who's the CIO of Estonia, who's a fantastic guy, and he's smiling like a model in the picture with his check shirt on. Okay, let's skip over that one. That's not really working. Then we have the Asian model, a continental model. You get it? It's, okay. So Asian model, so this is where the government does everything. This is the kind of the Aadhaar model. And there are some slight negatives to this, people starving to death and so on. But I mean, broadly speaking, it's a low-cost way of putting the system into place. I think you can buy access to the whole database for a few $100s now, can't you? It's all online somewhere, so yeah. So interesting, but I'm not sure if we want to copy that model. Then we have the Scandinavian model, the sort of bank-led model. So this is where the bank provides the identities and other people use it. So in places like Norway, this is used for I mean, not just for logging onto your bank. This is used for renting a car. I mean, you name it, renting a car, and it works. Actually, Norway's my favorite example at the moment, because in Norway, you can use your bank ID to get divorced, which I think sets a new benchmark for the use of digital identity. Seriously, you can log in with your bank ID to get... Is there anybody here from Norway? I'm not making this up, am I? Thank you very much. This is true.
It's not just true, it's unbelievably true.
It's unbelievably true. It works. So you log in with your bank ID, you log into the divorce portal, check a couple... Your wife gets like a text message or something, does she? I don't know. How does it... Oh, it's a PDF. Okay, good. So it's quite sensitive, a digitally signed, and it's a digitally signed PDF, so she can be confident in it. That's what we like to hear about. So my question is, and you know where I'm going with this. So my question is, we see what's happening around the world right now, and some of those things are working in certain cases, and they are. I mean, I know I was making fun, but in many cases they're solving real problems. But they're only solving one narrow set of those problems. So the question is, do any of those approaches seem right for a 21st century identity infrastructure? And obviously, I think the answer is no, otherwise I wouldn't be here talking about it. So let's move on to the next section and say to ourselves, okay, let's create a model of digital identity which might help us to build these more general purpose solutions which have wider applicability. So I thought I would start by showing a very quick model. So this is the three-domain identity model that we've been using for years, and it works very successfully. So 3DID, three-domain identity. So we break the world into these three domains. We have the identification domain, the authentication domain, and the authorization domain. And the important point about this model is that it separates, it stops digital identity from being this generic concept. It makes digital identity a very specific concept, which is the bridge between these real identities and these virtual identities. And it's very important to understand that all of the interactions that take place in the transactional field all take place in this far-right authorization domain. All transactions are between virtual identities. When I walk into Waitrose and buy something with my credit card, it's not Dave buying something from Waitrose. It's virtual Dave off in credit card space buying something from virtual Waitrose off in acquiring space. All transactions are between virtual identities. It's a very important thing. And we need that because we want control over what from the physical identities is ever disclosed. You listen to what the panel was saying about, what's that thing they say when life sends you GDPR, you make lemonade or something? What is it? I can't remember the thing. But the point is, we don't want personal data. You know that data is the new oil thing everybody says. Personal data is the new toxic waste. We don't want personal data polluting any of our transactional space. So digital identity is the bridge between the two spaces that stops that from happening. So and I will say one more thing about this. So this issue about, you can think of these virtual identities as, we were talking about multiple identities. Think of each virtual identity as being a different persona. You have lots of different personas in this virtual space. And those different personas might have different subsets of attributes associated with them, as the panel was saying. And that's the way of thinking about how we transport around those different packages of attributes that are appropriate. And as a general rule, I can't think it was a Jacob or Katrina, as a general rule, we want to use the virtual identities which contain only the attributes that are necessary for transactions to take place and no more. This is the data minimization principle. So if we look in the identification domain, there's a great asymmetry to that model because the identification domain, which is to do with linking digital identities to things in the real world, is complicated, time-consuming, expensive, and error-prone. So we want to minimize the amount of times that you can stop looking at it. It's a PCI DSS compliant slide. I've removed all of the personal data, and nobody needs to panic about this. Don't ring your GDPR people. I've very carefully taken off all of the personal data from this. This is just to illustrate a UK example. This is how you establish who somebody is in the UK. It's through a British Gas quarterly gas bill, which in England is the gold standard for identity, and we use it wherever possible. We don't believe in identity cards. They're a continental imposition. So we associate them with Napoleon, you see. That's why we don't like them. So basically, this is complicated and expensive. So therefore, we want to minimize the number of times we have to bind a digital identity to something in the real world. That's the asymmetry. In the authentication domain, I don't really want to talk about that because I see that as essentially a solved problem. We have frameworks like FIDO for the authentication to take place. We have lots of authentication technologies, fingerprint, face. Somebody was showing me a cool handwritten signature thing on the way in. There are lots of ways of solving the identity. I don't want to talk about this. I see this as a solved problem. In a world of smart cards and mobile phones and passive biometrics and AI and machine learning or whatever, as far as I'm concerned, authentication is a solved problem. Remember, authentication in my this is showing that you have ownership of the digital identity, the underlying digital identity. And then on the virtual side of things, in the authorization domain, we have interactions between the virtual identities that are specific to transactions. And those virtual identities might have attributes that have all sorts of third-party attestations. It might be the bank, it might be the government, it could just easily be Facebook or it doesn't matter. You talked about choice. This is where choice is a good example. When I go online to buy some glue and I have to prove that I'm over 16, there might be lots of different people that can tell whether I'm over 16 or not. And there's lots of different people you have the public keys for, you're perfectly happy to accept their digital signatures. It's up to me which one I supply to you. You shouldn't dictate to me which one it has to be. Okay, let's pick a couple of examples of that in use. Sorry, it's a bit small. So this is BBVA in Spain. You see they use the identification, authentication, authorization model to set up their essentially sovereign example, because in this example, this is for BBVA customers and BBVA clients, but it's a good example. It shows how those three domains are used in practice for financial services. Another example would be, if we look at the government example, this is the NIST framework in the US. I mean, they use slightly different words, but it's the similar thing. So basically, you know, the identity proofing, the authentication, and the federation is the same kind of thing. So I think, you know, we can see if we divide things in that 3D ID model, we can see it works for business, we can see it works for banking. It's good enough to help us move forward and think about solutions. So this is the basic paradigm that I want to use to think about how to make these general purpose solutions. And if we're technical people, the way technical people look at that table, because to me, because of my heritage, I see digital identities as key pairs, essentially. So when I see that, I think of a private key and a public key. And so therefore, I see that in the identification domain, the problem is binding real-world entities to private keys. We discussed this private key management issue earlier on the panel. And on the right-hand side, the authorization issue is to do with binding attributes to the public keys that are going to be used in transactions. And we can all see in our heads roughly how that could work, because we all understand digital signatures and certificates and so on. We can see how that would all work. We don't have to wait for new technology to come along and help us out there. Okay, good. Right, so now we have a model. We haven't got time for the Slido poll here, so I'll move over this. I was going to ask you at this point if there was anything missing from the model, but I thought it was going to be a smaller and more intimate workshop, so I don't think it'll quite work for this. Okay, so now let's look. So if you're happy with that model, that's a way of thinking about digital identity. What is technology doing to help us implement some of those solutions? So let's have a quick look at a few possibilities here. That picture, I think, shows us the general solution. For the markets that we're in here, we're talking about a world of smartphones, we're talking about a world of apps, We're talking about a world of third parties. We're talking about how GDPR has to make these things work properly and behave themselves. But I think we can see the sort of technological model that takes us forward. And before anybody starts moaning about, well, this means that everybody has to have a smartphone, you're in the Netherlands, everybody does. So, I mean, this is not a barrier to any kind of progress. And for the 8 people left in the Netherlands that don't have a smartphone, they can use Alexa. So we're fine. So let's pick 3 technologies. So I want to be optimistic with you. I want to show you that in each of those areas, I've picked out one technology to show you that technology is making the implementation of this model easier so that digital identity in the real world at scale is finally within grasp if we think about things properly. So the 3 technologies I've picked out are biometrics, blockchains, and bots. I don't know anything about cryptography, but I do know about marketing. So biometrics, it's clever, isn't it? Biometrics, blockchains, and bots. Yeah, it is. It's not too bad. So I've just picked out those 3. So let's use those 3 examples just to have some optimism about how things are moving along. So biometrics in the short term, we spoke on the main stage on Monday about the transition of biometrics from being a security technology in people's minds to being a convenience technology. I don't think there's any argument about this anymore. I think we also discussed the fact that using biometrics in the authentication domain is a good idea, right? Because we want to keep personal data safe. So using your fingerprint to authenticate you to match against a template that's in the phone, good idea. Using a biometric to identify you at population scale, not such a good idea because it can be abused and misused, maybe in the identity proofing process if the biometrics are thrown away afterwards. So what's the narrative around biometrics? Convenience in the mass market. We don't have to think about this stuff anymore. So I said I thought authentication was a solved problem. Biometrics close that off for us. The problem is solved. And by the way, we're moving into this era of passive biometrics as well. So don't think of biometrics as though you have to hold the phone up or touch your thumb, because we're not that far away from the situation where when I run my bank app and I want to do some sort of transfer, the bank app will know, right? This is like what payphone and people like that are doing. The bank app, well, this is Dave's phone. It's Dave's SIM. The SIM hasn't been changed. It's somewhere where Dave normally is. It's only been Dave using the phone since it turned it on. He's doing something that Dave normally does with Dave. It's Dave. Don't bother him with a pin. Just get on with it, right? We know it's Dave. Get on with it. In the medium term, the guys touched on blockchain on the panel this morning. I think, I know he stood up to my teasing rather well, I thought. But Roger made the point. We're using the word blockchain generically, which is, of course, wrong. A blockchain is one kind of shared ledger. You've got the spectrum of shared ledgers on my right-hand side, you've got the permissioned, double permissioned shared ledgers of the form that are used by banks and R3 and Quorum and stuff like that. Those are essentially unrelated to the permissionless, double permissionless shared ledgers on the left-hand side. You can't say we're going, by the way, I like to think of this as people and octopuses. Because if you draw a genetic taxonomy of intelligent creatures, the thing that's furthest away from people is octopuses, right? Because octopuses have eyes like we do, but theirs evolve separately. They have brains, but their brains evolve separately. They're different from ours. When we're finally wiped out by nuclear disaster and climate change, 1 to 2 million years, the octopuses will be in charge. That's why I don't eat octopus. I don't want to hedge any bets on this sort of thing. So you can think of like, it's like, R3 is like, you know, octopuses, Bitcoin's like people, or the other way around. The taxonomic distance between the two is huge. This is why I get annoyed when people say, well, we're going to use a blockchain. What? That's like saying we're going to use atoms to solve the problem. It doesn't tell you anything about the thing. So what's the medium-term narrative? The narrative is the thing that Katrina referred to, in my opinion, which is the issue of transparency. The thing that blockchain brings into this space is not, you know, the transactions are instant, they're not. The transactions are free, they're not. Forget all of that sort of stuff. The thing that blockchain brings into the identity space that we didn't have before is transparency. Roger talked about trustlessness. It means that you can know that things are right without having to, actually, and zero knowledge proofs are the perfect example of that. So I can prove that I'm over 18 to a bar without disclosing my age, my date of birth, any of those kind of things. So in that case, the zero knowledge proof, these are group proofs. So essentially, I'm proving to the bar that I'm a member of a group of people that are over 18, but the bar can't determine which member of that group I am, and it's cryptographically impossible for them to break that identity. And this creates the idea of what I like to call the glass bank, right? So the idea is that this comes from Depression-era America in the 1930s. It's an artist called Francis Keeley. In the 1930s, there was a terrible problem with bank robberies, as I'm sure you'll remember. It was a little different from what it is now, because in those days, the banks were robbed by people who didn't work for them. And so that had a very different dynamic that involved guns and all sorts of unpleasantness. And so people were thinking, how can we make the banks more safe? We build them out of steel and concrete. And this guy said no. He said, you can't rob a glass bank. If you build the bank out of glass, then if you go inside and hold up the teller, everybody walking past can see what's going on, and they can call the cops. So if you want to make the bank safer, you make it out of glass, not out of steel. And this is where I think the blockchain changes our thinking in the medium term. It delivers an ambient accountability in the space that we didn't have before, and if we use that intelligently, it means we can capture some of the benefits of that self-sovereignty, although we might not necessarily deliver them in that self-sovereign context because of the key management issues we were discussing before. So so I said to Roger, well, okay, so you leave your key with your brother-in-law. Is that really a solution? Well, of course it isn't. We need a much better solution to that sort of thing. So if you look in the case of Bitcoin, for example, my Bitcoin private wallet has a private key. You can print that private key out as a QR code. I have that QR code tattooed onto my scrotum. I take it with me everywhere I go. And for me, that's a good solution. Not sure it applies to everybody in the audience. They may need banks to look after these things for them. I'm self-sufficient for this sort of thing. In the long term, of course, in the long term, the only technology that counts in this space will be AI and machine learning. AI is a kind of event horizon. You can't see past it. Once there's AI in place, we don't really know what's going to happen. This is John Cryan, who, when I made this slide, was the boss of Deutsche Bank. He's not anymore. And he said, right now we have people that behave like robots. We're going to replace them with robots that behave like people. Not sure he cleared this with the HR department, by the way, which I don't know if that helped his case. But we can joke about it, but he's right. So we were having fun thinking about the identity of people and fraud, and we were having fun thinking about hacked fridges and so on. But the biggest problem that we have to face downstream is the identity of bots. It's like, how will you even know whether the person you're talking to is real? Google already demoed their super scary call center bot that rings you up and pretends to be a person, starts talking to you about the weather and whatever. What's your response to that going to be? It's bad enough when they phone you up now. Hello, this is Microsoft. There's a problem with your computer. You know what I always say to those guys? I'm like, when they come, hello, because I think they're bots. So I'm like, you're walking through the desert and you see a tortoise. That's a hilarious Blade Runner joke. Again, yeah, sorry. I really must update the demographics of these presentations to work better. So by the way, the funniest one is, I saw a community say, my wife hates me for doing this, but you get those calls sometimes in England. There's a big problem with scams about insurance. And so you get these calls from pretending to, and they say, I heard you were involved in an accident that wasn't your fault. It's really annoying. You get those calls all the time. So I waited, because this is in the kitchen. So I get this call, right? I put it on speakerphone so my wife can hear it. They go, heard you were in an accident and it wasn't your fault. So I'm like, how do you know about that? Because when I drove off, he was dead. That's how you find out if they're bots or not. It's just a little tip. Okay, so what's the net? So look, you think this is theoretical. Paul is going to step up here and show you some real examples. But I want you to understand that we're not just talking about digital identity as individual, isolated. We're talking about digital identity as an infrastructure for the future, for people, for things, for bots. And if we use these technologies intelligently, it's within our grasp to solve this properly. Now, you think I'm talking about this from a theoretical position. I'm going to ask Paul to come up on stage. I want you to give us three identities. I want you to give us three examples of large-scale identity deployment. Large-scale.
So why don't we talk about HSBC first? We had Andy Maguire on Monday morning. I think he kind of said everything that I was probably planning to say about make some things simple, put stuff in the hands of customers at scale, right, that they can use. We provide HSBC now with a digital identity platform that's underpinning innovation. And I think if you go back maybe 2 years ago, 3 years ago, and read any press around HSBC, and the big investment we're making, spending $1 billion to save $5 billion a year and really change the bank, the thing they kind of worked out very quickly was they can build lots of new product, right? They can get bots, they can have a whole digital innovation, but unless they can actually understand who their customer is, identify them, authenticate them, and then service them across 67 countries with different regulators, different cultures, different biometric requirements, with 60 million customers, 2 or 3 devices each, bots, fridges, toasters, all connected to that identity, never mind the average product holdings. That becomes really complicated stuff. And to do that in one platform at scale is challenging. So if you don't get that bit right, all the wonderful services you try and build across the top just don't work.
So that's a perfect example which addresses some of the things the panel said. It's cross-border, it's multi-country.
Absolutely, yeah. And that's forgetting open banking, PSD2, GDPR, privacy consent, that's on top.
But give the audience a sense of that. I mean, these people work for real businesses. Give people a sense of that deployment. How long did it take from having this sort of strategic vision to having the thing up and running? What were the complexities? I mean, if you don't mind, if you could share perhaps 1 or 2 of the things that, with hindsight now, you could see perhaps could have been done a little bit better. I don't want to put you on the spot, but...
Sure. Well, I think if you look back to before even we started speaking to probably HSBC 2 years ago, they themselves had publicly said they'd been spending 18 months, 2 years trying to get their own infrastructure to address the problem. So when you talk about, identity infrastructure dragging back the economy, it's probably quite true, right? Legacy infrastructure, particularly in large banks, just will not serve the need today, never mind the changing need we see going forward and at the pace. So we've been working with them for about 2 years. They're now starting to roll out in earnest. I very kindly had someone from one of HSBC's partners in France come to us yesterday saying they were interacting with our technology in France. And it's been used in many different ways, right? I mean, they're looking at cross-border identification with Orange Telecom, French government, taking an ID and now opening a bank account in the UK, something they couldn't do before, right? Rolling out Alexa, so you can have, you can ask for your bank balance via Alexa's coming. As a, seems quite simple, but very complicated to do at that scale across any number of countries.
So global bank, multi-country, tens of millions of people. We all understand the complexities of rolling those out inside those large organizations, coordinate different departments and so on. But 2 years from the sort of strategic vision to having the thing up and running.
Yep.
Okay, give us another large-scale example.
Look at the BBC.
BBC is what?
The UK broadcaster.
Oh, that BBC, yeah.
Yeah. And if you look at what they're doing in terms of transforming their business, I mean, think of what Netflix and Sky are doing to that industry, right? And you've got this broadcaster who's got a funding model by, I don't know if anybody knows, but in the UK, the funding model is I, as a person, pay a TV license. I pay it attributed to my address. And then you have all these new ways of delivering content out, and there's no connection between the two things. So the BBC's had to really transform the way it builds personal relationships with individuals. And I think the real key thing for them is going to be about the relationships of the family. And I think we've talked about graph technology as it's coming on board now within identity. I think that's really part of the future. It's not just about who am I, but it's who am I, what's my relationship with the things, my bots, who's in my family and my ecosystem. So with the BBC, think of me having an iPad. I sign in on my login. I've got the bill attached to my house address, but not me per se. But then there's all sorts of content being delivered. Needs to know what geographical location I'm in. If my child's signing in on my iPad and wants to watch content, is it age appropriate? How do you personalize? All of these things are underpinned by identity.
So I noticed that up until last year you didn't have to sign in, but now you have to sign in.
Absolutely.
And it keeps your preferences across devices and so on. So for the BBC, again, what kind of scale are we talking about? How many kind of identities are they bringing on?
So the interesting thing, the BBC just now is in excess of 20 million identities. But if you think about their plans to go beyond the UK, that number of identities will scale out, it's way beyond banks. And if you also think about the pressure that's on them in terms of access to their services, when the World Cup's coming up in a few days' time, when people want to watch the World Cup and they hit iPlayer within...
We said no World Cup stuff in the Netherlands. I mentioned that to you.
I'm from Scotland. I can say the World Cup. I've never been in the World Cup. I think I've ever seen a World Cup.
You've got the trump card, I forgot about that.
Thank you for reminding me. But when you look at the amount of people that access their systems within 2 or 3 minutes before they go live, it's off the charts in comparison to most other organizations. Right?
Yeah.
So in terms of performance and capability and access to identity, it's a real challenge, and so the way they've addressed that with cloud, etc.
You have tens of thousands of people registering at the same time, and it's all got to work and stay up. I understand. And again, can you give people a sort of sense of, so from the time they decided to move to this more strategic view of identity to the first people registering on the system, roughly how long are we talking about?
I think you said the first you noticed about a year ago you started having to register. They were already doing stuff with identity in the background, so moving you between different applications as they were dropping in different apps. They probably were about 18 months from conceptual thinking around what they were going to do to actually start putting stuff on the ground.
That's not too bad.
Well, it isn't, but I think the key thing I'd say across most of the customers, it really is a board decision, right? It's about transforming organizations, and I think we still have a lot of dialogue with prospects and customers where identity is seen as old world identity and access management in the domain of...
And something to do with IT.
Probably IT, right. And really to see real change in the organizations we work with, you've got to get it out of that domain in isolation, and it is more of an experience. It is about the change in organizations. It can be about cost, customer experience, and actually sometimes the competitive pressures you're seeing both in terms of banks and the likes of the BBC.
So give us a last example from an industry these guys might not be so familiar with.
Well, the industry, they might be, maybe not the name, so Armour Sports, a Finnish company we work with quite extensively. You probably don't know, but you'll know some of their products. Anyone ski? Use Salomon stuff? Sun 2 watches? Atomic? This is a number of...
You choosing skiing in the Netherlands is as bad as me choosing Blade Runner.
This is an international audience, right? Yeah. But they have a whole set of different brands, and they really want to keep those brands separate. But they've got a couple of challenges. So they're now having IoT play a big part in all of their sportswear. So connected skis is an example.
Connected to what?
Well, they want, first of all, want to connect it to the cloud so they can connect it to the app so that they can start to monitor your skiing and engage you in a different way. But they also have launched an app that is across all of their brands and not branded into any of their individual products, a Sport Tracker brand, that very consistently now they can share data between the various products and still have that unique experience within each of their brands. So the one I know you like is the basketball, right?
Yeah,
so
that's a good example.
You have a connected basketball. No longer now does your kid go out and just throw some hoops, but they can track how they're actually throwing the hoops, how their success criteria, they can help them to practice. And then as they start to use that in the tracker, then they can get different proposals and propositions and offers around other brands within the family that they can see connected to that sort of relationship.
So this is a good example because it's about people and things.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So
and bots. I mean, if you look at what we talk about banks, interesting thing about bots is what happens when they start acting on behalf of the bank or on behalf of you in a regulated environment. Where's the legal responsibility lie? Why would a bot have any... the requirement is exactly the same, if not more so, than you would on a human being and knowing who's undertaking those actions on your behalf.
Unfortunately, the emergency on-call lawyer has been called away to a discussion about GDPR in one of the other rooms. So let's come back to that a bit later on. Paul, this light's about to turn red any second. Can you just share with us in that example, again, I think what people would like to know is roughly how long from this idea we'll see identity in a more strategic way to seeing this kind of global rollout?
Again, probably about 12 to 18 months window. We're working on the technology side to try and make sure that we can make that faster. But really, it's mostly about process and culture in the organisation. And I think, one of the things we could all do better as an industry is, and I've noticed from some of the speeches and stuff I've joined in on, is about explaining digital identity more clearly and helping customers understand really what it is and how they apply it, because I think a lot of time is spent on trying to figure that stuff out before they then take action.
Good. Listen, we're out of time now, so I have to do the sort of very quick wrap-up. So I just want to say, first of all, thank you to the panel for helping us to frame the issues to be discussed at the very beginning of the session. Thank you for the questions and taking part. Thanks very much for coming along, Paul, because I wanted to show people that the models that we're constructing lead to effective implementations.
I agree.
At very large scale, and it was very kind of you to come along. Paul's going to be here for a few minutes, and he has his order book just under the table there. So if you'd like to pop up...
It's digital now, I've got it on my iPad.
Yeah, so if you'd like to pop up, it will require your identity, of course. Paul will be here for a few minutes. Please come and talk to him. Please join me in thanking all of the panelists and Paul for coming along here today. Thank you very much.